Welcome back to the deep dive. This is where we take a massive, often complex topic, look at all the angles, the source material, and really try to pull out the insights you need to get up to speed quickly and thoroughly. Today, we are definitely wading into some deep, and I'd say strategically vital, waters, global trade, specifically that huge, long-discussed pact, the India-EU Free Trade Agreement.
Yeah, huge is probably an understatement. It's potentially foundational for the next phase of global economic relationships. The stakes, honestly, couldn't be much higher for you listening and really for the world.
Absolutely.
We're talking about integrating India, fifth largest economy, demographic giant with the EU, a bloc that, accounts for nearly a fifth of global GDP. This isn't just tariffs, it's geopolitics wrapped in trade language.
And the numbers already show how big this relationship is, even without a formal FTA, right?
Yeah.
Looking at the 2023 figures from our sources, it's massive.
It is.
$124 billion in goods trade alone.
Right.
And services add another, almost $60 billion on top of that, $59.7 billion to be exact.
Yeah.
The EU is already India's biggest trading partner, so the potential is clearly there.
Exactly. The foundation's incredibly strong, but it's definitely under-optimized. It lacks that predictability, that security you get from a comprehensive formal agreement like this one aims to be.
So our mission for this deep dive, then, is to really unpack where things stand right now. We're recording this in October 2025. We need to dissect those 23 chapters everyone talks about.
The sheer complexity.
Look at the geopolitical currents pushing this thing forward with such urgency now, and try to figure out what success or failure actually means for global trade down the line. Okay, let's unpack this. So this agreement, it's not some new idea cooked up last year. It's got a long, long history, almost a saga, really. High hopes, then. Nothing for years.
That's right. A real roller coaster.
When did this whole thing actually kick off? And what were those initial sort of stumbling blocks that just stopped it dead in its tracks a decade ago?
Well, the initial buzz started way back in 2007. It followed the 7th India-EU summit. Negotiations launched. And you have to remember the context. This was peak globalization, peak free market optimism.
Right, that mid-2000s vibe.
Exactly. The thinking was, let's quickly lock in a partnership between the EU and this massive, fast-growing democracy, India. Seemed like a natural fit.
But quickly turned into a 10-year freeze, a complete stall.
Pretty much, yeah. From 2013 onwards, it just went cold.
So what were the specific points of disagreement, the really intractable ones?
They were fundamental, really hit the core differences. India as a developing economy, the EU with its very established complex regulatory system. 3 big roadblocks stood out.
Okay.
First, intellectual property, IP. The EU wanted much stronger protections, beyond the basics, and that clashed directly with India's huge and globally vital generic drug industry.
The generics issue, always central for India.
Yeah, absolutely critical. Second, agricultural market access. India was and remains extremely protective of its farmers, especially in dairy and poultry. They were determined to shield them from what they see as subsidized EU competition.
A politically explosive issue in India.
Hugely. And third, the classic problem, non-tariff barriers. Things like EU standards, certifications, testing requirements. India often saw these as, protectionism in disguise, designed to keep their products out.
So, okay, if those fundamental issues, IP, agriculture, standards, were so tough they caused a decade-long halt, the big question is, what changed? What powerful forces suddenly made both sides decide to relaunch talks in 2022? This is where geopolitics really takes center stage, isn't it?
It absolutely dominates the relaunch narrative. The world shifted dramatically in the late 2010s and early 2020s. First, the COVID-19 pandemic. That brutally exposed just how fragile global supply chains were, especially those heavily reliant on China.
Right, the concentration risk became undeniable.
Undeniable. Then, the Russia-Ukraine war. That completely scrambled Europe's strategic thinking, forcing a desperate search for stable, reliable, democratic partners who weren't aligned against them.
A diversification imperative.
Exactly. And layered over all of that is the accelerating U.S.-China rivalry. That made diversification, or de-risking as the EU likes to call it, an absolute strategic necessity for Brussels. They needed alternatives.
So it sounds less like a proactive move towards free trade for its own sake, and much more like a defensive, almost reactive geopolitical necessity. Build stable links outside that main U.S.-China tension.
I think that's a very fair assessment. For the EU, yes, it's about market access, but it's fundamentally defensive and strategic too. Secure supply lines, partner with a country that, notionally at least, shares democratic values. It's big part of their pivot towards the Indo-Pacific.
And you see that reflected in the rhetoric, too.
Definitely. There was that quote from EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen in 2025, framing the ambition. She said, "This could be the largest deal of its kind anywhere in the world."
That's a huge statement.
It is. It lifts it beyond just trade figures. It's about setting up, the pillars for a different kind of globalization, maybe one centered more on shared values or strategic alignment.
Okay, so given that long history and this renewed, intense urgency, where are we right now? It's October 2025. What's the status?
We're at a really critical point. They've been moving at, frankly, an almost breakneck speed considering the deal's complexity. 13 rounds of negotiations are done.
13 already?
Yes. And the 14th round is literally about to start in Brussels on October 6th. The target they're aiming for is incredibly aggressive. A conclusion by December 2025.
Wow, this December.
That's the goal. You can feel the pressure. They want this locked down before the political calendars in 2026 start getting crowded with elections and other things. The window feels tight.
That kind of timeline suggests they must have made some real progress, surely? Gotten some wins on the board?
Oh, definitely. Significant ground has been covered, especially on the, let's say, more modern or procedural aspects. The 12th round, back in July 2025, for example, they reached agreement in principle on digital trade rules and also an anti-fraud clause.
Okay, those sound important.
They are. And maybe more concretely, several entire chapters are apparently closed or very nearly closed. Things like customs procedures, making regulations transparent, some parts of IPR, setting good regulatory practices. These are often seen as the less contentious groundwork.
The low-hanging fruit, maybe?
You could say that. Building the procedural foundation.
But, and there's always a but in these things, getting the easier bits done doesn't mean the core historical conflicts are solved. Our sources are picking up on quite a contrast in tone, suggesting things might be getting tense now they're hitting the really hard stuff.
That tension is absolutely there. It's the reality of negotiation hitting crunch time. On one side, you have the Indian Commerce Minister, Piyush Goyal, sounding quite optimistic, publicly stating they can hit that December deadline. That shows the political push from Delhi.
Okay.
But on the other hand, you have the EU envoy, Hervé Delphin, who came out after the 13th round in September with a pretty sharp warning. He called it a missed opportunity.
Ouch. That's strong language in diplomacy.
It is. And it's tactical, of course. It's a signal flare. It says, look, we've closed some chapters, but the really big ticket items, agriculture, those geographical indications, labor standards, maybe CBAM, are still causing major friction. The deadline's approaching, and the core trade-offs haven't been fully resolved. This is where the real political muscle comes into play. The veto players back home start making noise, and you really need to grasp the scope here to understand the friction. We mentioned 23 chapters. That sheer number tells you how comprehensive, how ambitious this thing is.
Right.
What's really fascinating, I think, is how the structure of the deal itself forces this kind of confrontation. It pits India's, historical priorities, especially its protectionist streaks in certain areas, directly against its future ambitions in high-tech, in services, and global integration.
23 chapters is a lot to digest. Let's start with the traditional heart of any FTA, goods trade, tariffs. What are the main asks from each side here, and where's that protectionism pit you mentioned?
Yeah, the tariff talks really zoom in on sensitive, high-value, or highly protected sectors. India is pushing hard for the EU to lower or just eliminate tariffs on things it wants to export more of: cars, certain textiles, wines, spirits, trying to get better access to that huge European consumer market.
Makes sense. And the EU's demand?
It's the mirror image focused on their sensitive spot, agriculture. They want significant, ideally immediate, market access for their dairy and poultry products.
And there it is, the direct clash. India's protected farmers versus the EU's, well, often heavily subsidized agricultural sector.
Exactly, head-on collision. The EU's dairy and poultry can be incredibly competitive globally, partly due to those subsidies. India is absolutely determined to shield its own farmers. We're talking hundreds of millions of livelihoods from what they see as unfair competition, potentially devastating imports.
Politically, probably the single most sensitive chapter for India. You just have to look at past farmer protests whenever trade liberalization comes up.
Precisely. It's a political landmine.
Okay, moving to another historically sensitive area, intellectual property rights, IPR. You said it was a deal breaker back in 2013, largely because of India's massive generic drug industry. What's the fight about now? Is it the same issue?
It's largely the same core tension, yes. India is fiercely defending its role as the pharmacy of the developing world.
Hmm.
The EU, often seen as championing the interests of big pharmaceutical companies, is pushing for what are called TRIPS Plus provisions.
TRIPS Plus. Can you break that down? What does that mean in practice?
Sure. So TRIPS Plus is the basic WTO agreement on intellectual property. TRIPS Pluses means going beyond those minimum standards. It could involve things like data exclusivity, protecting the clinical trial data for new drugs for longer periods.
Which delays generics.
Exactly. It delays when generic manufacturers can use that data to get their own versions approved. Or it could mean patent term extensions, stretching patents beyond the standard 20 years.
And India's resisting this. Why?
It's fundamentally about public health for them. The argument from New Delhi is that these stronger IP protections, especially on medicines, would make essential drugs way too expensive for their own population, and also for millions across the developing world who depend on affordable Indian generics. It's a huge battle, both economically and, frankly, morally.
Beyond medicines, IP also has this cultural, commercial dimension,
Right.
geographical indications or GIs. What's the specific fight there? Which products are we talking about?
This is another fascinating clash, blending heritage with big money. The EU is demanding really strict protection for its high-value GIs. Think Scotch whiskey, champagne, Parma ham, specific cheeses. They want to stop counterfeits and lock down market exclusivity for the genuine article.
Makes sense for them, high-value brands.
Absolutely. But India is pushing back just as hard for its own iconic products. They want robust, legally enforced recognition for GIs like basmati rice and Darjeeling tea. Billions in export value are at stake here, plus the whole idea of protecting the authenticity and reputation of these premium goods.
Okay, let's shift gears to the modern economy, digital trade and data sovereignty. This feels like newer territory, but maybe just as contentious. Data flows are critical, but so are national security worries now.
Hugely contentious, and they're coming at it from almost opposite philosophical corners, regulatory corners. The EU generally pushes for maximum free flow of data across borders. They see it as essential for digital business, for multinationals to operate smoothly.
Standard EU position, really.
Pretty much. India, however, has major reservations. They are insisting on data localization measures.
Meaning the data has to stay physically within India? Essentially, yes. Mandating that certain types of data, or data from Indian citizens, must be stored on servers located within India's borders. The argument is about protecting national sovereignty, ensuring data security, and guaranteeing that their own law enforcement can access data when needed.
That obviously creates big headaches and costs for international tech companies operating there. The EU must see that as a trade barrier.
They absolutely do. It requires significant investment in local infrastructure. But for India, it's framed as a core issue of national control over what they see as a strategic national resource data, especially in an era of, sophisticated cyber threats and global surveillance concerns. They don't want sensitive data flowing freely outside their jurisdiction.
Okay, one more key area from the 23 chapters, services and mobility. This seems like it could be potentially transformative for India, given their strengths in IT and their huge pool of skilled workers. What's the main thing India is pushing for here? India's #1 goal in services is about people. Specifically, making it much easier for their highly skilled professionals to work in the EU. The key phrase here is mutual recognition agreements, or MRAs.
MRAs for professional qualifications. What does that actually mean on the ground?
It means cutting through a lot of red tape. Right now, an engineering degree from a top Indian university might not be automatically accepted in, say, Germany or France. The engineer might need extra exams, certifications, years of hassle.
Right.
An MRA would essentially say, okay, we've compared standards, and we agree that these Indian qualifications are equivalent to our own. It would harmonize those standards, making it much quicker and simpler for Indian engineers, doctors, architects, IT specialists to take up jobs, even temporary project work in the EU.
That sounds like a huge potential win for India's service economy.
It's absolutely central to their strategy, leveraging that massive pool of human capital, that powerhouse services sector, on the global stage. This chapter could unlock enormous value for them.
All right, let's move to what might be the most controversial part of this whole negotiation. The linkage, the connection between trade access and these non-trade issues. Environment, labor standards. It really begs the question, doesn't it? Is this genuinely about climate leadership and workers' rights, or is it just commerce with a green or social label?
That is precisely the fault line, the absolute core of the political and economic tension right now. The EU side is pretty inflexible on this. They insist these FTAs must have strong, binding chapters on environment, on labor, on human rights. It's all tied into their big domestic project, the European Green Deal.
Right.
For India, though, this looks like the EU trying to impose external constraints on their development path, on their policy choices. And the biggest flashpoint, the most concrete example of this clash, is one specific, very technical, but hugely impactful mechanism, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, CBAM.
CBM. Okay, let's make this clear for everyone listening. It sounds technical, maybe even boring, but the potential economic hit for Indian exporters could be enormous.
Yeah.
Can you just walk us through how CBAM works?
Sure. CBAM is, at its heart, a tariff. It's a tax applied at the EU border on imports of certain goods that are carbon intensive to produce. The amount of the tax depends on the carbon emissions generated during the production process back in the exporting country, like India.
And the goal is?
The stated goal is to prevent what the EU calls carbon leakage. That's the fear that high carbon prices within the EU will just cause European companies to move their polluting production overseas to countries with weaker environmental rules. So by taxing imports like steel and aluminum, the EU says it's leveling the playing field, making sure imports face a similar carbon cost to domestic production.
Okay, so it's meant to equalize carbon costs. But what are the real-world cost implications for India's key industries? You mentioned steel and aluminum.
The potential impact is huge. India is a major global player in both steel and aluminum, and let's be frank, their production methods often rely heavily on coal and are quite carbon intensive right now. Our sources suggest CBAM could literally add billions in extra costs for Indian exporters, hitting them with tariffs and complex compliance burdens. It could significantly damage their competitiveness in that vital European market. This isn't some distant threat. CBAM is being phased in, and India needs solutions or concessions built into this FTA like yesterday.
So you end up with these two completely opposite stories about the same mechanism. The EU says this is essential climate leadership. How does India argue against that?
India sees it through a completely different lens. The lens of development, of fairness, of historical responsibility. The Indian perspective is pretty clear. They view CBAM as disguised protectionism.
Strong words.
Very. And some critics in Delhi go even further, calling it eco-imperialism. The core argument is this. Developed countries, like those in the EU, built their wealth over centuries using cheap, carbon-intensive energy. Now that they're rich, they're using climate policy to erect new trade barriers that disproportionately punish developing nations like India, which still needs affordable heavy industry for basic development, for infrastructure, for lifting people out of poverty.
Their point being, you caused the problem, now you're penalizing us for trying to catch up.
Essentially, yes. They argue the EU should be offering climate finance technology transfer to help them decarbonize, not imposing punitive tariffs that hinder their growth.
And beyond CBAM, the EU is also pushing hard on linking the FTA to labor and human rights standards. Why the resistance from India there? It sounds positive on the surface.
India's resistance is rooted in sovereignty and development priorities. It's not that India rejects international labor standards wholesale. They are members of the ILO, the International Labor Organization, and adhere to core conventions. But they strongly resist the idea that trade agreements should be used by external partners to dictate specific domestic labor laws or human rights policies.
They see it as interference.
Yes, as an infringement on their national sovereignty, their right to set their own path. And often, there's a perception that these standards, while laudable, can be used as another subtle barrier, or that they prioritize Western social concerns over India's immediate need for rapid economic growth and job creation. It's that classic North-South tension again, the developed world leveraging regulatory power, the developing world prioritizing autonomy.
Okay, so if tariffs like CBAM and strict mandates are causing so much friction, did our sources offer any alternatives? Any more cooperative ways to achieve the climate goals without just blocking trade?
There's an interesting out-of-the-box idea floated, yes. It's about shifting from coercion, the stick of tariffs towards cooperation. Instead of just relying on CBAM, the EU and India could potentially establish a joint India-EU Green Innovation Fund.
A dedicated fund? How would that work?
The idea would be to create a formal pot of money, a mechanism to channel significant EU financial support, and crucially, technology transfer directly into helping key Indian industries, steel, cement, aluminum, the big emitters, to decarbonize their actual production processes.
So helping them meet the standards rather than just penalizing them for not meeting them yet?
Exactly. It acknowledges the shared goal of climate action, but frames it within developmental fairness. It gives Indian industry a pathway, funded partly by the EU, to meet those greener standards without facing immediate, potentially crippling tariffs. It tries to balance the environment with fair market access. And if we really zoom out now, connect all these complex trade details back to the big picture, this India-EU FTA, it's fundamentally a huge strategic bet, a hedge for both sides. It goes way beyond just trying to increase trade numbers.
Right.
It's about positioning themselves, securing reliable partners in this messy, fragmented, multipolar world we're living in.
Let's break that down. Starting with India. What's the strategic win for New Delhi here? How does this deal give them leverage or insurance?
For India, this FTA is a vital strategic anchor. First, it offers significant diversification, less reliance on the U.S. market, where trade talks have often been difficult and, frankly, subject to political whims. Remember those Trump-era tariffs?
The unpredictability.
Exactly. And critically, it provides a major alternative to China, both as a market and as part of the supply chain. A successful deal with the EU acts as a kind of economic insurance policy. It proves India can negotiate and close these massive, complex, high-standard agreements with major democratic powers. That strengthens their hand everywhere, globally. It adds a really solid Europe dimension to their foreign policy.
And flipping that, what about the EU? Why is locking in this deal with India so strategically crucial for Brussels right now?
For the EU, it's a cornerstone of their whole de-risking strategy regarding China. They desperately need to diversify supply chains away from that over-reliance. India represents not just a gigantic growing market, but also a potential manufacturing and services hub that, importantly, operates within a democratic framework, however imperfect.
So a strategic partner as well as an economic one.
Definitely. Getting a strong economic foothold in Asia's fastest-growing major economy is absolutely vital for the EU to project influence, to maintain relevance, and to build strategic resilience in that really contested Indo-Pacific region.
But India's strategic position isn't simple. They have this long-standing relationship with Russia, particularly on energy and defense. Our sources mention this complicates things. How so?
Yeah, that definitely adds a layer of political complexity. The negotiations are happening against the backdrop of India continuing to buy significant amounts of Russian oil imports, actually surged after the Ukraine war began.
Right, much to the West's discomfort.
Exactly. And India also continues to participate in joint military exercises with Russia, like the Zapad 2025 drills mentioned in the sources. For the EU, which has gone all in on sanctions against Russia and emphasizes solidarity on that front, negotiating a landmark trade deal with a major nation still deeply engaged economically and militarily with Moscow, well, it requires a tricky balancing act.
A political tightrope walk, as you said earlier.
Precisely. The negotiators basically have to try and compartmentalize, separate the huge potential trade benefits from these awkward strategic and political divergences. It's not easy.
Now, to really grasp the leverage India has, and maybe its strategy, it's useful to compare this EU negotiation with other trade deals India's been working on recently. They've been quite active. Let's look at the UK FTA and the EFTA deal.
Yeah, this comparison is really insightful. It shows how India's approach might be evolving. The India-UK FTA, which was signed back in July 2025 but still needs ratification, that looks more like a traditional post-Brexit type of deal.
Oh, so?
Its main focus seems to be relatively quick tariff cuts on a large percentage of goods. The figures mentioned were 94% of UK exports, 90% of Indian exports, targeting those high-volume items like Scotch whiskey, cars, textiles. There are some mobility elements, but it feels primarily like a goods-focused tariff-slashing exercise.
Yeah.
Relatively standard.
Okay. But the India TEPA, the deal with Switzerland, Norway, Iceland, Liechtenstein, that one seems different. And it's already in effect, right, since October 1st, 2025.
Exactly. And that's why it's potentially more instructive for understanding India's possible playbook with the EU. The India-EFTA agreement is India's first big European deal actually in force. And what makes it unique, really stand out, is how heavily investment-linked it is.
Investment-linked, meaning?
Meaning the EFTA countries didn't just get market access, they made a very specific, very concrete commitment alongside the trade deal. They pledged $100 billion in foreign direct investment into India over the next 15 years.
Wow, $100 billion. That's a massive figure.
It is. And tied to that, a pledge to help create 1 million jobs in India. This shifts the whole dynamic. It's not just about lowering tariffs, it's about guaranteeing a significant inflow of developmental capital and job creation in return for opening India's market.
So India is essentially saying market access for you comes with concrete investment and jobs for us.
That seems to be the model they successfully implemented there. It shows an evolving strategy, perhaps, demanding tangible, measurable development benefits, not just theoretical gains from trade liberalization. So the takeaway from comparing these deals is the UK one offers maybe speed and tariff cuts. The EFTA one offers that investment security. But the EU FTA, that remains the biggest prize.
Yeah.
The largest, the most comprehensive, the most ambitious by far. It combines elements of both, plus deep regulatory alignment. It's still the ultimate test case for how India redefines its place in the global trade order.
Okay, let's think about another major player,
Yeah.
the U.S. Given the, let's say, often stop-start nature of India-U.S. trade discussions and some real friction points historically, like those Trump administration tariffs, sometimes linked to things like India buying Russian oil, could a successful India-EU deal actually serve as a kind of template, a blueprint for eventual talks with the U.S.?
It could certainly provide a partial blueprint, absolutely. On the economic substance, many of the frameworks they hammer out with the EU, how they structure tariff reductions, rules on IP, even if contentious, digital trade provisions, maybe mechanisms for small and medium enterprise access to these could potentially be adapted or replicated for a U.S. context.
So it sets precedents.
It sets precedents, and maybe more importantly, it significantly strengthens India's negotiating position vis-à-vis Washington. Successfully concluding a high-standard, complex FTA with a bloc like the EU demonstrates India has the capacity, the legal framework, the political will to do these kinds of deals. It sends a signal.
The U.S. and the EU approach trade very differently, don't they? How would that EU template need to change to fit the U.S. style?
That's the crucial caveat. Our sources are quite clear on this. The U.S. approach is generally seen as much more transactional, more overtly protectionist at times, compared to the EU's model.
Yes.
Well, while the EU often uses regulatory leverage pushing for alignment on sustainability, labor standards, data rules, the U.S. traditionally relies more on blunter tools, direct tariff threats, sector-specific retaliation, focusing on immediate market access gains. So any blueprint from the EU would need significant adaptation to what the sources call the U.S.'s more aggressive style. It would likely involve less focus on deep regulatory convergence and more hard bargaining over specific market openings.
And are the actual sensitive sectors the really tough nuts to crack, similar in both negotiations? For India, dealing with the EU versus the U.S.?
Yes, remarkably similar. It highlights India's persistent domestic challenges. We're talking autos, dairy, pharmaceuticals, especially IPR around generics, and specific agricultural products. These are likely to be major sticking points with Washington, just as they are with Brussels. India's defense of its generic drug industry, for instance, will face powerful lobbies on both sides of the Atlantic.
So same fights, different negotiating styles, perhaps?
Largely, yes. Although one potential area where an EU win could create positive precedent for U.S. talks is services liberalization. If India gets significant concessions on MRAs for professionals from the EU, they could absolutely use that as leverage in their ongoing discussions with the U.S. about things like H-1B visas and easier movement for their skilled workers.
Okay, let's pivot to the potential payoff. Assuming they manage to get this massive deal over the line, maybe even by that ambitious December 2025 deadline, what are the projected benefits? What's the upside?
The projections are, well, pretty substantial. Various studies cited suggest we could see a 30 to 50% increase in bilateral trade within about a decade of the agreement coming into force.
30 to 50%. That's huge growth.
It is. And in terms of annual economic benefits, the estimates hover around 8 to 10 billion each per year for both India and the EU. For the EU, that translates into better market access, more security for their existing investments in India, which are already significant, around 87 billion in FDI stock. For India, it means more secure export markets, potential for significant job creation, technology transfer, a real economic boost.
But as with any deal this big, there have to be risks, downsides, potential pitfalls. What's the main vulnerability for India that critics point to?
The primary concern, voiced often by critics within India, is the risk of widening trade deficits in goods. The fear is that if the agreement doesn't have strong enough safeguards, particularly against subsidized imports in sensitive sectors like agriculture or manufacturing, India could find itself importing much more from the EU than it exports, harming domestic producers.
And this isn't just theoretical, right? This echoes fears from past negotiations.
Exactly. It directly mirrors the concerns that led India to ultimately pull out of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, negotiations back in 2019.
Can you just quickly remind us why India left RCEP? What was the core issue there?
The core fear with RCEP was that joining would flood India's domestic market, especially hurting its dairy farmers, small manufacturers, agricultural producers with cheap, highly competitive goods, particularly from China, but also from Southeast Asian nations. The worry then, very similar to the worry now with the EU, is that while India's service sector is globally competitive, its goods sector, particularly agriculture and some manufacturing, needs continued protection, especially when facing large, advanced, often subsidized economies. And this really brings us full circle, doesn't it? It highlights that fundamental internal tension within the Indian economy that this FTA throws into sharp relief.
That clash you mentioned earlier, the pull between protecting the past and embracing a more liberalized future.
Precisely. The tension between agrarian protectionism, the political and social need to shield millions of vulnerable farmers, who are also a massive voting bloc, and the push for IT-led liberalization, the desire to open doors globally for its world-class engineers, coders, service providers, the drivers of India's modern economy and high-value exports. How New Delhi ultimately chooses to balance these two powerful, often conflicting forces will be written into the final text of this FTA. So if we try to synthesize everything we've unpacked here, the India-EU FTA, it's really operating on two levels. Yes, it's a trade negotiation, but maybe more accurately, it's a massive geopolitical undertaking shaped by global forces. It's caught right in the middle, squeezed between intense domestic political pressures, those farmer protests, the green lobbies in Europe, protectionist industries, and this undeniable global necessity for stable, diversified partnerships in a world that feels increasingly unstable and fragmented.
And the sheer speed they're attempting now, aiming for December 2025 after that decade of silence, it just hammers home how strategically urgent both Brussels and New Delhi view this alignment.
It's definitely the speed of necessity, driven by those external shifts we talked about, the search for reliable partners. And perhaps the key takeaway for you listening to this is that the future of globalization, as reflected in deals like this, probably isn't going to be a return to some kind of free trade utopia. That moment seems to have passed.
So what is it then?
It looks more like a move towards managed interdependence. Building relationships based on clearly defined rules, yes, but also acknowledging and managing sensitivities, built around shared strategic interests, perhaps, rather than just pursuing purely open, unregulated markets above all else.
And as we've touched on throughout, the final shape of this deal, the actual concessions made, won't just be decided by the negotiators in those closed rooms in Brussels or Delhi.
Absolutely not. We have to remember the real-world veto players. The dairy farmers in Punjab who fear those subsidized EU imports have real political power. The green activists and labor unions in Brussels insisting on strong environmental and human rights links, they have power too. Their influence back home will ultimately shape which chapters get finalized, what compromises are made. It's a negotiation happening simultaneously at the trade table and in the domestic political arenas of both sides.
This has been a fascinating, really detailed exploration of a deal that truly sits at that intersection of global commerce and high-stakes geopolitics.
And if it's still if this agreement does get signed, perhaps by that December 2025 target, it will absolutely set important precedents. Precedents for how other major powers, other democratic blocs, try to navigate this tricky balance between protecting national interests, pursuing development goals, and engaging in high-standard global economic integration in this new era. So maybe the final thought for you to consider is, what does the success, or indeed the potential failure of this huge undertaking, tell us about the future direction of global governance and the kind of world trading system we might see emerging over the next decade?